It is such an honor to have this session with these fabulous, fabulous people. They're all incredible leaders in different dimensions of 988 crisis services, all these different people coming together. And I think that really speaks to where the behavioral health field is right now, at least in the US. And I know that it's budding in Canada, and it just, in the United States right now, the trajectory is 988 and building out crisis service systems. And in the years that I've been part of the behavioral health field and working for the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors, I've never, ever witnessed the behavioral health field coming together so strongly to move something forward. It is a uniting experience to see that, and I'm just so honored to be with these leaders today. The first wonderful leader I'm going to introduce is Dr. Anita Everett. She is the director of the Center for Mental Health Services for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And we have a wonderful partnership with SAMHSA, and I'm just so pleased to introduce her. Thank you, Anita. Go ahead.
I think I need your mic. Yes, you do. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you so much for having me, having us here from SAMHSA, from CMHS, and thank you to IAMHL and also to NASHBID for the wonderful partnership and all the work that goes into convening these kinds of events. So thank you. I also am going to take a little bit of a risk with my opening remarks. I know that from yesterday and also today, just who's in the room, I know we have some great storytellers here. I won't claim to be a great storyteller, but I am going to give a little anecdote that illustrates some of the what we hope for with regards to 988. So I'm going to start out by having us think about one family with two sons, both teenagers. One son is a soccer athlete, has an injury on the field one day. What happens to that son? Play stops. All the other teammates sit down in honor of sort of what's going on until there's an analysis done. The family runs over to see the child or see the teen. And everyone that's in the context of that kind of knows what could happen. If he's had an injury, they'll call 911. If 911 comes, there'll be an ambulance that will come or some emergency medical service first responder type person that will come. He'll go to an emergency room where he'll work with medical staff who are accustomed to and comfortable with assessing what's going on with him orthopedically or whatever else needs to happen. Everyone kind of has an understanding about that. Mm-hmm. Same family, different son. One day develops acute suicidal ideation in his bedroom and locks the door and won't let his mother in. What's that mother, what kind of options does that mother or does that family have or does that son have with regards to how to respond to what may or may not be a psychiatric emergency? It's really not even known. This is a family that doesn't really know how to work with that. And so what happens to that son? Do they try to get into the house, assess what's going on? What skills do they have? Does the family even have mental health awareness of what the range of things could happen? Is there a way to sort of talk with somebody? Do we call 911 for that situation? And what if the family's in a community that prefers not to have 911 involved in their emergency situations because it involves law enforcement, and law enforcement can take a different path that we don't want? What our vision is for that family, for that situation, is really how we built 988 and how we built the related crisis services vision around that whole thing. And that is that family would know that they could call 988 as opposed to 911, and they could talk with someone. And they would know from talking with 988, because they'd read our reports and our white papers and all those things, they would know that the call alone has an 80% chance of sort of helping that person through the scenario that they're in right now. They would know that they'd be talking with a trained counselor, and they would know that they would get a response for the call. They would also know or have some degree of confidence that if they needed a first responder on site, the first responder would be more likely to be a trained set of people, presumably or preferably with a trained behavioral health specialist as well as a peer to companion them that would come and be able to come on site to help the child or the teen as well as the family through the scenario. Then they would also know, furthermore, if the situation couldn't be resolved and a plan couldn't be made to stabilize the situation at hand, they would know that they would have a place to go, that maybe an emergency room with skilled professionals who felt comfortable with their talents and skills in diagnosing and treating or stabilizing mental illnesses, and or they'd be taking, and increasingly we're seeing, to an urgent care facility that specializes in behavioral health treatment. Sometimes we call those crisis receiving center. That's our problem statement for the whole scenario that we've talked about at SAMHSA, is having those 3 layers. So someone to talk with, someone to respond if that's needed, and a place to go if that level of care is needed. So that's sort of where we're going and where we are. I do want to give you just a tiny bit of the history of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, where we are right now with regards to since we have transitioned, and then a tiny bit about our vision for the future. So the line that we now call 911 is actually 21 years old. It took a while for it to get where it was. It was started with a very small budget in 2001. It was a small number of crisis call centers that were connected. We went over the next 20 years from having less than 1 million calls a year to before we switched to 988 having something like 12 million or so calls a year to the call line. So every year, over year, the number of calls increased over time. Along the way, we learned a couple things that were really helpful for us with regards to from some rigorous evaluation studies were done. We learned, one, that it matters if the people on the other end are trained. So if you just have volunteers, the people working in what they think is their best interest didn't always work out. And so we learned that training is really a core element. The other thing we learned is that the calls themselves really do make a difference. This was learned through a series of look-back type efforts that were done to call people that had an interface with the crisis call center. And I forgot the exact number, but something like 80 or 90% of them said that they were on the edge and would have died by suicide had they not made the call and talked with individuals. So we're very, we've had a number of different activities over the years that have kind of created a confluence of things that resulted in a tipping point that got us to the point where we are right now with regards to having the congressional mandate to change what was previously known as the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, a 1-800 number, to a now much more readily available 988 line. And there were a number of different, your typical types of government activities, including an activity that has a national meeting tomorrow called the Interdepartmental Serious Mental Illness Coordinating Committee, all of which sort of converged around recommending strengthening our crisis response system. Where are we now? So this transitioned from the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline to 988 July 16th. And we have created in SAMHSA a specialized office that is sort of like a special SWAT team of the 988 variant, I guess you'd say. They work with a lot of the details of the rollout. But because of the work that they and others have done over the last years, we're now in a situation where we have 2 months of data, and we have really good response rates. We have, with 90% or so of the calls are answered within 20 seconds, which is new data or new information because before our lifeline was so underfunded that it didn't have that response rate. One other thing that we're learning or that we're seeing, just a little bit of early information, is that we also added along the way, along those 20 years, a text and a chat component to that. And what we're seeing right now is that youth, by far and away, individuals less than 25 years old, way prefer the text and chat. And so one of our staff, Richard McKeon, who's been involved in this project from the very beginning, was very firm on the idea that we can't not fund or not have the capacity for the text and the chat. And we do, and he was right. It turns out that is by far and away preferred by individuals that are youth. So we're pretty proud of those statistics, and we're hoping that builds out. What we see in the future, for us, is the building out, as was referenced, building out other layers of the system. In addition to support for the line itself, the technology that has to do with supporting the call centers themselves, oftentimes which historically have been dependent on volunteers. We've infused enough money into the system that many of them now are in paid positions, which we're very proud of. So we strengthened the line itself, but we also have, through NASHBID and other sorts of resources, provided money, and through our block grant system, we've provided money to states to build up the other components, the mobile crisis services elements. So we are seeing increasing numbers of communities that have that as an alternative to law enforcement response. And we also are seeing the development of urgent care centers, if not full-on crisis receiving centers. So that is part of our future. A couple other little smaller, things, maybe not small, but a couple other things that we have been working on is we wanted to make sure in any kind of design that we approach, that we develop, we don't leave out children. And so we do have a special document that outlines features of a system as it grows forward that will include children. Or ideas. It's a white paper, ideas on how to develop systems with regards to crisis. It's in federal clearance at this point in time, but our part at SAMHSA is done. It's upstream from where it is. So I expect that to be available very soon. And I think we've learned along the way that partnerships are really valuable. This is something that applies to all of us, gives a resource to all of us. And there's no way one federal agency, one state agency, anything could have done this. And so we are really seeing, as Meighan suggested, a rally around, let's see if we can get this developed so that we have a 988 that in many ways is parallel to a 911, and families like that family can have a son that has a psychiatric crisis that can be addressed with the kind of confidence that we can address situations that come up that are medical 911 type emergencies. So that's sort of where we've been, where we are, and where we're going, and I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Everett. I now want to introduce Mylan Barnes. I was recently introduced to Mylan Barnes 3 or 4 days ago. Yeah.
Yes.
And I feel like I know her like my whole life. She is fabulous. She's a passionate youth leader. She is currently an administrative assistant with the DC Department of Behavioral Health, Transition Age Youth Division. And I'm going to turn this over to you, Mylan.
Thank you. I want to say good afternoon to everyone. Okay. You can't hear me? Okay. Excuse me. Basically, again, my name is Mylan Barnes. I'm 21 years old, from Washington, D.C. Just to give a little bit about me, I used to be a youth who was in the juvenile system when it came to incarceration, foster care. I've probably experienced a lot of disparities that people wouldn't believe, mental illnesses, and watching my own little brother go through his first episode of psychosis, or my mom experiencing schizophrenia, growing up with a dad that has bipolar, and then learning about my own bipolar depression 1. It was a lot to be a transitional age youth, meaning I was 16 to 25, in a sense at that age range, figuring out who I am, but still having to navigate everyday life, meaning finding employment, doing school. It was hard, and I think everybody in this room can relate to understanding how hard it can be. So when I heard about this opportunity, I'm like, oh wow, this is awesome. Because honestly, I never thought I would be in a room like this, but also because it's an opportunity for me to bring awareness to that aspect of where I come from, that environment. We lack a resource such as 988 to be able to have that 911 for mental health. But I feel like she was able to cover that greatly. So that's not going to be my point today. My point is more so on how to basically engage youth with 988. What can we do to further educate the communities that we know are not aware of these resources, who aren't able to come together like how we are to really be serious and passionate about these issues. For me, mental health services saved my life, honestly. So I went from, abusing substances, being around the wrong crowds, environments, to now I'm actually a peer support specialist myself. Actually through an opportunity with SAMHSA and DBH, I gained an internship where I was able to be a case management intern and learn more about vital records. I learned how to help people like me navigate the system. And so now I help others basically achieve their goals, regardless of what barriers they have been through or experienced. So now being in my role, what I do is I try to take on anything and learn it and grasp it so I can give it back to people just like me. And so with 988, I was going around asking everybody like, hey, y'all know about 988? They're like, what? What's 988? Is that 911? I'm like, no, you guys, it's for mental health, right? Because we're still in the era where we're breaking the stigmas of mental health. So when you see that, and with my job, what we saw was that, wow, a lot of youth are on Instagram right now. They're on Facebook, they're on Twitter. What if we made a social media page just full of mental health stigmas, definitions, quotes? And that's exactly what we chose to do. And so DBH, the Department of Behavioral Health's Transitional Age Youth team, we have a social media page, and it's highly interactive. It's called Take Our Time, and not to throw it out there to take any shine, but just basically giving a concept of how we could approach this when it comes to really trying to interact with that population. Because like you said, most of the calls were from people who were under 25. And so it's like really pouring into the engagement style of that age range. And so that would be social media. Also, I had a colleague earlier show me a pretty cool video, and it was pretty awesome. It was very engaging, it was very graphic, and it had different celebrities and influencers in it that youth would know. And on top of that, it was talking about how you can call out for help. I feel like the more that we take peers like me, you know what I'm saying, and we actually put us out there highlighting these different resources and how they actually work, it would be awesome. Because at this point, we have all these awesome people doing this development work and, you know, really pulling it together so that it's able to work with crisis on different levels and work with people on different levels, meet them where they are, even texting. Like, come on, that's cool, right? Like, I never thought I could text someone and be like, hey, I'm having a mental breakdown. Can you help me? I feel like if I had a resource like that when I was younger, I probably could have avoided a lot of my, you know, life's mistakes or crises in a sense. Because, you know, what youth want is to be heard, to feel loved unconditionally, to feel wanted even during their processes, to be trusted with responsibility. And so to see all of us coming together and, you know, really building a platform, that's pretty cool. But also it's a time to brainstorm on how can we get to the people who aren't in these rooms, who aren't able to access these rooms. How can I educate them? And so if we look at it, social media, TikToks, everybody loves a TikTok, right? And so what I guess I want to basically end with would be that I'm very honored to be in this room. And what I've learned from going around to family and friends asking about 988 was basically that we lacked education in our community about it. Because first thing they thought was, dang, 911 again? I'm like, nah, y'all, what? It's not 911. This is like, and I'm not saying, I don't want to say that, but this is something very awesome that could be implemented for mental health. If we take our physical health as serious as we do, well, our mental health as serious as we do our physical health, we would see a lot of improvement. And I want to say that if 988 was to be implemented in that way, where we were expanding, expounding, and really educating others, we would see that reflecting in the youth and the young adults that are upcoming today. Because when you feel cared about, you walk into school a little bit brighter. When you feel cared about, you get up, you feel a little bit brighter. So I guess just basically bringing awareness to that. And a lot of youth and young adults don't know that they're experiencing anxiety. They don't know they're experiencing bipolar. They don't know what depression is. I almost didn't know what it was until I went through it, and I had to learn it the hard way. My first panic attack, I was like, am I dying right now? And of course I wasn't, but I didn't know that. And so that's what I would like to end with, is that I'm very honored to be here. It takes a lot of work to get here, and so us doing this work now helps somebody who is trying to get or navigate these kinds of rooms. So thank you.
Thank you, Mylan, and thank you for your uplifting and inspirational way.
Thank you.
We've got that. Now we're going to introduce Stephanie Priest. She's the Acting Director General for the Center for Mental Health and Wellbeing for the Public Health Agency of Canada. Yeah?
That's
okay.
right.
Good. And she is, that's in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. So Stephanie is a leader in 988 in Canada and is working really hard. And I just want to acknowledge her awesome, awesome work. Let's give Stephanie a hand before she even talks.
Can everybody hear me? Yes. Thank you, Meighan. That was lovely. And I'm also very honored to be here. You'll notice I have notes, and it's because I tend to talk a lot, I'm told, when I'm passionate about something. And I'm very passionate about 988. And I'm also going to tell a story that's my own personal reflection about transformation. And I'm going to tell it the way older people tell it. And it goes like this. When I was young, you know, I had to go walk up like 5 miles to school with no snow boots, et cetera, et cetera. But when I was young, my house had a telephone that was drilled to the wall. And my mom had a list of numbers beside that telephone, and they started with the police, then the fire department, then the hospital, poison control, and then maybe grandma's house. And every babysitter that came was oriented to those emergency numbers. And then sometime in my youth, and I can't really remember when, that changed when 911 came to Ottawa. And the fact that I can't really remember when it happened, but that it is now so much part of our culture, is really interesting to me, because I think that's what's going to happen with 988. I think we're on the cusp of a similar transformation that could be as large as 911. It's an opportunity to do the same for mental health crisis and suicide prevention. Moving away from a patchwork in Canada of crisis services and distress lines that are sometimes connected, sometimes not, often depends on where you live, to something that is integrated, to something that where the first call or a first responder that you get on the phone is somebody who is trained with mental health crisis response and suicide prevention. I think that's really important. I heard this as well from what's going on in the US. In Canada, we're about a year behind the US with this. Maybe a little bit more, but we have a year. So what's happened in Canada is our Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, which is like the FCC here, released its determination on August 30th of this year and recommended a 3-digit number for suicide prevention and mental health crisis. And they assigned 988. This is the number, they said, that Canadians can call or text 24/7 anywhere in Canada in English and in French when they need immediate help for suicide prevention and crisis support. And they indicated that our telecommunication system in Canada need about 15 months to be ready, and that brings us to a launch on November 30th, 2023. And that is the date that is ingrained in my head. It's 1 year from now, and we have a lot to do for us to reach that milestone. But there is planning that's underway with our partners across the country to support the service delivery for 988, not just the telecommunications infrastructure. So earlier this fall, the government announced that the Centre for Addictions and Mental Health, which is located in Toronto, will lead the coordination of 988 service delivery, and that's building on their experience in delivering Talk Suicide Canada with partners like the Canadian Mental Health Association, who are here today. But we know, and I heard this from Anita and others here, that you can't deliver 988 by yourself. No one organization can do this. The service needs to be built in collaboration, and it needs to leverage the existing expertise, the existing capacity that we have across the country in our communities and with our young people and different populations. We need to determine together what a successful 988 delivery system looks like. And that, I think, is the foundation of that transformation. It can build not only what we're calling this as the front door, but also build that access into other transformations that need to happen within our mental health and our public health systems. And those things you've heard about today and in your own work around integrated youth services, around population mental health promotion that is more integrated into our systems, around policing services, and how all that comes together. So 988 isn't solving all of those problems, or all of those challenges, I should say, but it is an important front door and first step. So I'm going to close my remarks with my hope for the future, because I think, and I've worked in suicide prevention now for quite some time, and hope is a foundation for suicide prevention and, quite frankly, for our mental well-being. So here's my hope, and I'm going to read this so I say it right. My hope is that our fellow youth here, Mylan and Katlyn, will someday be speaking to an audience like this, maybe 20 years from now. And they're going to start with, when I was young. When I was young, people had to remember multiple different numbers just to call for help if they needed help with their mental health or if they were having thoughts of suicide. And you couldn't count on the service. It really depended where you lived, and sometimes it depended who you were. and you were put on a thing that we used to call hold. And you were made to wait, sometimes for 45 minutes or longer. Can you imagine? I don't think you can imagine, because we transformed our system with 988. And we were all part of it. That's my hope. I think this is a tremendous opportunity. Look, I have more time left. I think we have the opportunity to build on the strengths and the assets that we are seeing and I'm hearing today and in my work. And when I said, I think to Meighan, I think why she gave me this a clap was that, this is 988 keeps me up at night. But 988 keeps me up at night for a number of different reasons. I am a little daunted, I'm going to be honest, because 1 year is coming close. But I'm also excited because when I hear what you're saying, Mylan, what Anita and the team at SAMHSA and the US are doing, and they've been so generous with their knowledge and sharing. And I just think that is such a tremendous opportunity. It brings me back to 911 and what it must have been like at the time. And so I'm excited. Thanks.
Stephanie, thank you so much. Just really moving. I love that vision. Love it. To have the entry point be 988 and have that be normal, like that's the way it is, and people didn't know it was different. That's really awesome. Really awesome. Thank you for all your work. Yeah. I'm now going to turn it to Katlyn Kotila. And Katlyn is the chairperson for Fierté Sudbury Pride. And she is a youth leader in Canada for LGBTQI issues. And I'm going to turn to you, Katlyn. Go right ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me this afternoon. Perfect. So as mentioned, my name's Katlyn, she, her pronouns. And I always feel a little bit strange being in spaces like this because I never imagined myself being in the mental health sector. In fact, my day job, I'm a social media manager. So this is wildly out of what I ever thought I would be doing. But I was propelled into this sector from lived personal experience. At the age of 14 years old, I lost a very close friend to suicide. And that really started my very complex journey with grief and mental health. And through that experience, I learned firsthand what it can be like not only to lose someone to suicide, but also to struggle with suicidality myself and to struggle for seeking help and not having help available to me, not knowing where to go, and when I ask for help, not having care that is going to be appropriate for myself and that's going to be informed on the kind of grief that I'm going through. For those of you who've never experienced suicide loss is something that is very different from regular loss. There is a lot of guilt and complex feelings that go with this kind of grief that is really hard to explain. And for those of you who've experienced it, I'm here with you and I'm sending you so much love because I know whenever someone mentions it, I feel it right in my heart right here. And through that grief, I really, really struggled. And when I sought out help, I guess I didn't introduce this part, but I'm from Sudbury, which is, for those of you familiar with Canada, you usually probably know Toronto. That's a good starting point. I'm about 4.5 hours north of Toronto. And where I live, to access any sort of care, I have to get in a bus or get in a car and drive 30 minutes to get into the center of town just to try to go to a crisis center. And once I get to that crisis center, I'm not guaranteed help. In fact, I'm likely to be turned away. And I'm likely to be told, okay, we'll add you to a wait list. We'll see you in about 8 weeks. Wait times in my city are extreme, and when you're going through this kind of grief, you're going through these kind of emotions, you don't have 8 weeks to spare. It is urgent. You need that help now. And what we're seeing, especially within rural and northern communities within our area, is that a lot of these people who are losing their life to suicide, it's not because they haven't asked for help. It's not because they don't want help. It's because when they asked, they weren't given the help that they need, and they weren't given timely help that was identity affirming and that was culturally affirming. And that's why I think that a number like this is so incredibly important. Now, we've had a couple of conversations, and part of that conversation we talked about is that a crisis line like this is not going to change the system necessarily. It's not the fix-all, it's not a Band-Aid solution. There are so many changes that need to be done within this mental health system that still need to be done. But what this does is it starts that entry point into getting the help and care that you need in an accessible way. It makes it so that if I don't have to hop on a bus and take that bus into town or drive when I'm already struggling. I don't know if anyone's tried to drive when they're upset, but that's really hard to do and quite dangerous. And so having a line like this to call or to text in immediate need is going to be absolutely game-changing, especially within these northern and rural communities in which we don't have access to the same type of care as someone who is living within a city who can just, walk down the street and get that same type of care. So that is why I believe that a number like this is so incredibly important, and I'm so happy to see it coming to Canada and coming to fruition. The only thing is, and I talked about how this doesn't change the system, and when I say that, is there are still a lot of gaps in service, and there are still a lot of things that we need to consider when we talk about this line to make sure that we're not causing more harm than good. Because at the end of the day, a little bit about me, I am a part of the 2S LGBT+ community. I'm out and proud and able to speak about it, but not everyone is. And oftentimes, when I've gone to access care, we had this conversation this morning, actually, for those of you who were in the breakout earlier today. When I go to access care, I have to explain for 30 to 40 minutes about my identity and my life and my community and all of those things. And when I'm in an urgent need of help right now, we don't have the time for that. And not only that, but it's more harmful than good. And so one of the most important things I believe when it comes to this line is that we're working with community partners, we're working with communities who are going to be needing this help the most, is that we're making sure that we're providing the right care. Because timely care is important, but proper care is also important. That we're making sure that when people are accessing this line, that we're not going to cause more harm. And that's one of the biggest things we've seen actually in my community is when people have gone to our crisis services, is that oftentimes they've left feeling worse than they did when they got there. They were misgendered, their identities were mocked, their care was not culturally appropriate. And what's happened is that it's left them feeling as if they were worse than before they even went. So why would I go in the first place? And so when we talk about this line, I want to bring that up. Because as much as I believe this is a truly game-changing number and that this is going to be so incredibly important, we need to make sure that the quality is there as well. Because we need to be able to ensure that everyone is able to access care that they need, and we need to make sure that the quality of care is high and that we're ensuring that everyone gets the highest possible quality of care so that we can all thrive, regardless of identity, regardless of geography, regardless of any of those things. Because every single person who is in need of that care deserves it. We all deserve, everyone in this room, everyone within our countries, within our communities, we all deserve to be thriving. We all deserve to live a life in which we can feel good, we can feel happy, and we don't have to struggle anymore. And I believe that taking steps like this, having accessible lines like this is a great first step in making that a reality. And I don't think that's far off to say. A lot of people, when I say this, are like, oh, well, there's always going to be problems. And yes, there is always going to be problems. But I believe that rather than dwelling on those problems, rather than saying they exist and they're never going to change and that's just how it is, by taking these steps, like putting in a 988, you're taking that first step towards that reality. You're creating a world in which everyone can, at the very least, access that care when they're in that need. And that is fantastic. And I don't know about you, but that gives me hope for the future. Because when I needed hope or help the most, it wasn't there. I didn't know where to go to. In fact, I walked into a walk-in clinic. I remember I was in crisis and I said, I don't really know where I'm going, what to do. I walked into a walk-in clinic. They gave me some anti-anxiety and antidepressant medication and sent me on my way. And so that's the reality that I faced. And I have hope, as you mentioned, for the future, that with these steps we're taking, that somebody else who was in my shoes at the age of 14, when they go to access that help, they don't have to go through that anymore. They just give it a call and they know exactly what to do, and that care is there. And so I'm very hopeful, and I'm grateful to see every single one of your faces here, because I know that we're all going to have a huge role to play in making this possible. And I know that all of you being here and being open to listening to what people have to say and being open to wanting to improve yourself and improve the services that you're providing others, or that the people who you're working with are providing to others, and wanting to improve that, that's a great first step. Another thing I want to mention in terms of this line is the importance of making sure that we're considering, and we talked about this again in the intersectionality topic earlier today, but we're considering how certain services affect marginalized communities. When we talk about 988, one of the big concerns that's always come up when looking to the US is policing, and how policing affects marginalized communities, and how there needs to be transparency in terms of what type of calls are going to seek that external, those external resources. Because oftentimes people, especially within marginalized communities, are not even going to want to contact those resources, are not going to want to pick up the phone to call if they know that they are going to be in danger. Even if, it's one of the last things that'll be contacted, if they know there is a possibility, won't even consider picking up the phone. And I think that that is a huge barrier to access when we talk about these services, because we need to make sure people feel safe accessing them. It's great to make it available, but if people don't feel safe picking up that phone and calling, that is another huge problem. And so I know there's lots of conversation, and I don't have the answer. And I think in terms of addressing that larger issue, it needs to be done with the communities who are going to be most affected. It needs to be done by having those people at the table, talking about their concerns, and talking too about what will help them to feel safe. Because, like I said, I don't have the answers. And I don't expect anyone here, any one person, to have the answers. It's a group conversation, it's a community conversation, and it's one that we need to do together. Because things that make me feel unsafe are going to be different than things that make you feel unsafe and you unsafe. And so we need to have that larger, broader conversation as we go through the implementation process of this 988 and bringing it to Canada. And so that's really important in general in terms of this line, is making sure that all of the people who are going to actually access this care have been at the table. That I always talk about youth engagement, and it's my biggest pet peeve is when we talk about youth engagement and we consult youth at the beginning, then we do all of this work without them, and at the very end we say, okay, so what do you think of what we did? We did good, right? Yeah. And it's like, okay, but you didn't engage us through any of the rest of the process. You sat there and let me pour my heart out to you, and then didn't take any of my feedback and did whatever you wanted anyways. And now you're asking for my stamp of approval to make sure that, oh yeah, we consulted young people. So that's another kind of thing I want to make sure, and I know that that's in the works, obviously, but something that's so important in terms of making sure through this implementation process, as we work through that year to get this rolling, that the right people are at the table throughout every single step. Every single step, we need to make sure that they're at the table, that their voices are being respected and heard, and that we're not just kind of consulting and then going about our way and ignoring the actual needs of the end user. Because they're the ones who are going to be using the service. They're the ones who are actually going to have to live with whatever decisions that we're making. And so that's so important. And it really starts with a willingness to actually properly consult and learn and to respect voices. And so I'm very grateful to be here today because I'm somebody who, I'm young, right? I'm 23 years old, and I don't have a PhD. In fact, I'm not even done my undergraduate yet. And so when I speak, oftentimes people are like, okay, but what authority do you have to say that? You know, what research do you have to back that up? You know, who are you to say these things? And it's like, my research is my lived experience. It's my community members who I see every day. It's the people who I've had to console after they've come back from crisis services in tears because they got harmful care. It's the people who I've had to create lists of gender-affirming and sexuality-affirming care providers because we can't trust which care provider we go to is actually going to be good for us and who's going to send us to the hospital or who's going to be more harmful. And so that's the research I come from, is the everyday experience of having to live it as an end user and seeing all of my community members and people around me having to live it. And seeing my community members don't call 911 when somebody is struggling with an overdose because they're afraid of the police, right? That's a very real reality we see every day within our communities. And that should not be neglected. And so that's really what I have to say. So thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it. And as I said, I'm hopeful for the future. And I know that every single person in this room has a role to play. I know I'm from Canada, but in the US as well, in not only improving 988, but bringing 988 to Canada and helping to make this what I believe could really be a global movement. I hope to see this expand all across the globe and be something that can benefit every single person so that we can build a society and a world where my vision for the future becomes a reality. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Katlyn. Thank you very, very much. And you raised really important concerns. What I wanted to do was, after the four of you have heard each other talk, I wonder if we could just go down the line and just, if you have any additional comments, just pithy, but just sort of your first thoughts. Go ahead, Stephanie first. Yeah.
Okay, I think I'm not supposed to hold two mics.
I was trying to give it back.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm going to pick up on a couple of things Katlyn said about safety and cultural safety on these crisis services. That is paramount. So when we're looking at creating this service, and we're in very early days, and we want to do that with all different groups across Canada to get that advice, because we're looking at it from two perspectives, quality and capacity. So from a quality perspective, ensuring that the right protocols have been developed and co-developed with people that use the lines and the services so that it is, and that there is a cultural safety that is built into these programs. That has to be, we see that as, when I say paramount, that has to be built in advance. It's not something that you launch and then you start to build that out. The other piece is around capacity, and capacity is a real issue, meaning how do you hire the people that will be the responders. We have issues right now in our health system post-COVID around health, human resources, and staffing within our health services and mental health services. That is a challenge, but it's not just a challenge in getting the bodies in, it is also making sure that there is appropriate training for everybody. And that we're getting a diverse group of responders in that can speak from different perspectives and create that safety within the system. And then finally on policing, it is something that we are seized with as well. I think in Canada, there are some pockets of some very innovative programs that would be worthwhile looking at and understanding a little bit better on what works as far as responding to a mental health crisis, doing mental wellness checks, or suicide calls, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that area, and that is part of safety as well. So 988 is one part of a mental health and suicide crisis service, but there's a continuum of crisis services around that as well. And when and how to call in those different services is just as important. We need to have a real conversation about that. And there are realities in rural communities, northern communities, Indigenous communities in Canada, where it's often the same person because there's just not those resources. So it's the same person making all those calls. And I'm worried as well about their own well-being in making those, in attending to their community. So all of these things are in our conversations right now and are really important.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just going to come back down the line. Mylan,
okay.
what are your thoughts? It's okay. She's got a mic.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. I'm like, honestly, I wanted to say, for one, you guys are awesome. Keep going. It takes a lot to show up. I know that from showing up myself. But really, seriously, just not taking what was said today lightly. We talked about integrating systems. We talked about how that could look. And I feel like what's so awesome about this conversation is that it's two sides. We're talking about how can we improve it in the US, and then we're talking about how can we develop it in Canada. That's a lot. We're doing teamwork right now. I feel like the one point that I really heard that I feel like reflected on us in a sense was when you was talking about the community organizations. We have community organizations in DC, such as Cure the Streets, Trigger Project DC, trying to bring awareness to all of them. Dolls and Dreams, I can go on and on. Dream to Soar, even the DC Doors, that's a low barrier 24-hour drop-in center. All of these different platforms should be used on 988 in a sense, right? Because they do the daily engagements. They're the ones in the field doing the daily work. So I feel like when we talk about integrating systems, it goes deeper into basically like, okay, how do we get the hospitals and mental health together? Like it's going to make more thought because like you said, there are different gaps. And so basically that's my input.
Great. Thank you.
No problem.
Anita, what are your thoughts?
Yep. So I noticed the trend of all of us have some awareness of the time it's going to take to build things out more fully. So every once in a while have to take stock of the fact that in the U.S. it took 60 years pretty much for the concept to develop. So instead of your mother's phone list including an ambulance line that was separate than whatever, now we have one number that we can call that everyone remembers or is programmed in their phone. So the timing, the notion that it's going to take a while is important. But we started with something that gives ready access right away. We started with the call component, which I do think is really important. That gets people help right away, and we know that helps a lot of people. The other thing I wanted to pick back up on was the notion of training, and also your notion about messaging, because what the nuance or one of the struggles that we've had with regards to how you get the word out about this is when most of us have called 911 at one point or another in our lives, you kind of know the 911 person is not a helper, they're a dispatcher. They sort you out. Do you need fire? Do you need police? Do you need emergency medical? What do you need? So they help in that way, but it's not, they don't talk to you. They just find out what your problem is and where it is and how they can send somebody. The 988 number is different. It involves talking to someone. So the notion that you brought up about training the right person, we want these individuals that are the call takers to be sensitive to the needs of what might be different if you're from an AIAN Indigenous community, or if you're from an LGBTQ community, or a community that is in a context of a place that doesn't like to call any numbers because the police are too often the first responders. So messaging to differential groups I think that's part of what we're going to have to sort of work on. That's going to be a challenge, I think, as we move forward. We've been talking with some of the people that do social marketing, and the terms they use are like the air game and the ground game. And I think the air game usually applies to what we are currently seeing or where we are right now developmentally in the States. There's frequently messages on the radio that have anything to do with suicide will say, call 988. But that's sort of a universal, broad thing. We do need special messaging to help different groups of people that might access the line or might need to access the line understand that it's different. So in the scenario of the suicidal child up in his bedroom, he would know to call 911 or chat or text 911 and or his parents or whomever else is in his environment. So those are just some observations that I had. And the other big sort of thing for us also is thinking about children and how far we need training for individuals who can talk with a 12-year-old, a 22-year-old, a 32-year-old, but how far what's the sort of what kind of training do we need the call takers to have there that can get appropriate help to the person, both in the context of the conversation as well as if there does need to be mobile dispatch unit or even a referral to a place. How do they know about those resources? So we've got a lot of work to do, is what I'm saying, but we've also got time to do it.
Great, thank you so much. I wanted to give the opportunity just for a few, like maybe one or two comments from the crowd.
Thanks so much for this. And I just wanted to bring attention that there is, in the U.S., there is a tribal 988, Washington State. And it's a model for other states. And it launches November 10th. The tribes in Washington State got together. And the reason it came to being was because the Washington State House Bill 1477. So they have a carve out of the telecom dollars in Washington State. They created a native 988, and they spent a lot of time on the logo to make it indigenized for the Pacific Northwest, Washington State tribes, and the name. So they don't call it 988. They call it Native and Strong. And it's launching November 10th. So, and it's part of the statewide, it's part of the U.S. system, but it's a model for other states and Canada as well. Mm-hmm. And they're trained specifically in the same as 988, in addition to trauma-informed tribal experience and all of that.
Fantastic. I'm going to give it to, Vic Armstrong, and then I'm just going to have Brian Hepburn wrap up.
There you go.
Okay, so one of the things that's been key to 911 has not only been that the person experiencing the crisis knows to call 911, but people witnessing a crisis know to call 911. And that's the one piece I have not heard about with 988, is whether there's any plan around marketing that aspect of it. Because my fear, and several of you have alluded to it, so like Dr. Everett, if you and I are in the same space, if you have a mental health emergency and you're in crisis, the response to you is going to be very different than the response to me if I have a crisis. And I feel like without us doing any kind of marketing, the response to anyone who witnesses me having a mental health emergency is always going to be to opt for their safety to my safety. They're going to dial 911. So how do we educate people that 988 is not just for the person experiencing the emergency, but for the person who's also witnessing someone experiencing a mental health emergency?
Oh, okay. I did want to take a stab at it, excuse me. In my eyes, the way that I view, and I feel like that's a really awesome question, first King. Secondly, what I would like to say is that's why I feel like pushing education is really important. Because see, with that, I feel like it would be kind of like, okay, I see that they're having a moment. I don't know what kind of moment. What can I do? Where can I figure this out at? Maybe I can reach out to this 3-number number and call and say, okay, well, he's having symptoms, he's having a manic moment, basically trying to explain what's going on, in a sense, I guess. I'm just trying to explain maybe how I visualized the answer to your question when you asked it. Of course, we have a lot of development to do, but I feel like education is basically my answer to that. Because if you were educated on what schizophrenia looked like, you would be able to call and be like, hey, I have a brother, he's having a schizophrenic moment. How can I help him in the meantime of wait being on the way? Because I don't see the manic episode ceasing anytime soon. I feel like if we're coming from a space where we want to help and also understanding, yes, your safety is very important, and that's why that education is important, because you will also know like the different triggers and when things will be becoming heightened, and that's kind of how it is at the drop-in center. You kind of have to know and be on your feet, because a youth could have a moment any second. And for me, I was being trained while working there, so I was very nervous. I'm like, okay, if I do one wrong thing while somebody's having a psychosis moment, I could get hurt. But as I learned, like same thing with psychopath, narcissism, bipolar, all of these different things have different stereotypes to them too, different stigmas. So we want to learn about them so that we don't kind of push them on others, but learn how to help others. So that's my answer. But I feel like these educated ladies might have some other insight as well.
Do we have the time for me to add something quickly to that? I just want to add too, so in my day job, I mentioned I'm a social media manager. I work for the downtown Sudbury BIA. And those of you who work in downtown areas, you know the unique challenges that that area can cause. And so we actually have a program called the Welcoming Streets Program. And what this program is that we have 2 outreach workers who go around and create relationships with people who are unhoused, living on the streets, and are able to build those connections so that when there's somebody who is going through a mental health crisis within a business or on the street, everyone in our community knows exactly who to call in order to make sure that we get help that's not going to be the police. And that's really been the biggest game changer for us. And I think what would be really wonderful is if 988, I don't see it right now, but in the future, if we could develop to become something like that, so that we can teach people how to be better bystanders. So that when we see someone going through a crisis, if we call 988 and like you said, say, this is what is going on, here is what we see, how do I help? How do we make sure that this person is able to get the care? And I think that would be an incredible way for 988 to evolve, is to become similar to 911. When I see someone overdosing, they're going to coach me through what I should do as I wait for the ambulance to come. And similar to that, it can become something like that where we can try to create it in a way that, and again, I don't see it right now, but in the future as we evolve, that it can become where we start to become better peers and bystanders through this line. So that's my vision for the future. But
Great. Thanks, Katlyn. And we're going to end with Anita Everett.
Well, I just want to say trust is an important factor to what you're saying, Victor, because I think, we know that there are many communities that don't trust the kind of response that you'd get otherwise. And so I think over time, and I'm interested in your work because the younger folks are sort of building up a culture, hopefully, of trust that'll be in a different way, that'll not be once a system like that is not trusted, it really is going to take a long time to repair the trust, building it back. So we're very worried about that, and so we hope that it's built on trust because it works well, and that's a potential problem. I agree.
Well, thank you so much for all of your leadership, and thanks for the opportunity to have this panel today and for everybody attending. Thank you, everyone.